I'm so glad to be here today. So I want to give a little bit of framing by saying that I've spent the last several years researching local government in times of fiscal crisis, which means that I've spent certainly a lot of time on the Rust Belt and Michigan and Detroit. And before getting to the substance of my remarks, I want to explain why I've been so fixated on this region and these cities. I'm from San Francisco, which, as everybody knows, is one of the hubs of Silicon Valley, and our economy there is testing new extremes in wealth inequality. The bottom of our economy is swelling with larger and larger ranks of low-skilled and hyper-competitive jobs. Low-skilled, hyper-competitive jobs, which means that they are extremely low-paid. That is essentially the result of a trickle-down economy from an upper class that is concentrating more and more wealth. And as one tiny example of this, as you may have read, Facebook just bought a Silicon Valley company called WhatsApp for $16 billion. And WhatsApp had 55 employees. $16 billion, 55 employees. So we are inventing or testing the flourishing of an economy that creates money without creating jobs. And so I've been watching Detroit closely, I really believe, not as a voyeur on the poverty here, not as a voyeur on the suffering that is very real in all of these cities. I have been watching you because you were the birthplace of the American middle class. And I like to believe that you could be the place for the rebirth of the American middle class. And I have come to believe that Silicon Valley and its kin cannot provide that leadership. So we need these cities to struggle through these problems and regain their legacy as a deeper distribution of wealth in our economy. Okay, but I want to focus my remarks here on three discrete points that'll go really fast. One is that since the 2008 crash, there have been 28 cities that have gone into insolvency, formal receivership programs, or bankruptcy. So Detroit is not alone. There are many other cities that would have gone into receivership, cities in New York, cities in other states, but their states bailed them out behind the scenes. So this doesn't mean that only 28 cities have suffered the kind of cash shortfalls that you heard about and these complex long-term commitments that they can't afford, but simply that these are the cities where the state government has chosen receiverships or bankruptcy as the solution. These cities include big cities like Detroit, single company manufacturing towns where the major employer closed down 15, 20, 30 years ago, and smaller suburbs. In fact, some of the sort of proudest, earliest pioneer suburbs for the black middle class are on this list. And many of these cities, like Detroit, are what we should think of as the urban equivalent of military veterans. They were enormous centers of the American military-industrial complex, including all of the 3 cities in California that have gone bankrupt. So besides being post-industrial, these cities have 4 things in common, and it's not corruption or mismanagement. One is extreme household poverty and high unemployment. Every single city on this list has some of the highest rates of poverty in its state. It is household poverty that is driving fiscal distress. Second is that all of them have a severe othering of their population by their metro areas. The suburban areas because of interracial mistrust, fear, and bias. mingled with high poverty rates that come from, high crime rates that come from poverty, have meant a severe sort of fear and distancing of these cities from their overall environment, whether they are inner ring suburbs or central cities or rural cities that are company towns in Rust Belt, Pennsylvania. Third, these cities have an aged and obsolete built environment, coupled with acute population loss. So you all know the long-term population loss story in Detroit. Even the Sun Belt insolvencies have had enormous population loss in the recession itself. The 3 cities that have gone into bankruptcy in California and other cities that have struggled had 3 to 6% population losses in a few years. That is an enormous surplus in housing. It's a vacancy rate that is a problem in a similar way to the long-term hemorrhaging of population across the Rust Belt. Third, the local education and job training and availability of jobs in these cities are woefully inadequate to lead the residential population out of poverty. All of them have collapsing and troubled school systems, and all of them have a mismatch between the local skill set and access to jobs. So these are all structural issues, and as I think everybody here appreciates, Chapter 9 and receiverships have nothing to do with any of them. Chapter 9 is not a mechanism for addressing poverty. It's not a mechanism for addressing these kinds of structural issues. And any politicians who say that bankruptcy or receiverships can fix these issues are either being false or foolish. These problems require investments, not debt restructuring alone. However, debt restructuring can be important if it doesn't draw more stigma that impedes the relocation of businesses and jobs to the city, and if it won't concentrate extreme fiscal losses in the lives of individuals like pensioners. So, I mean, this really boils down to the bottom line message of this day, which is that this city needs a plan of recovery, not just a plan of restructuring. Second is a quicker point, but something that is really food for thought for you. All of these cities have seen a radical thinning of the local public sector. As you guys know well in Detroit, but it's happening in all of these cities, your local government is shedding responsibilities. It is basically boiling down to a core of tax collection, police, and fire. And there used to be a vision for the local public sector that included things like youth development. I worked in public housing youth development for years. We could never have done that without state support. Youth development, indigent nursing care and housing for the elderly, public preschools, imagine that. So you all, I think, really need to think about what you want from Detroit's bankruptcy tomorrow. What do you want? I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. What you want from Detroit's government after the bankruptcy? What is your vision of Detroit's city government? What do you want them responsible for? You have probably already lost Belle Isle, and you're probably going to lose the DIA collection for sure. What do you want? Do you want Kresge to be funding public preschools in addition to land use planning? What's the next plan for your government? Last point is that before the structural changes can take place here in Detroit, the state of Michigan has to fundamentally see its linked fate with the people of Detroit. And I know that it is a source of great sorrow for people in the room that Michigan has indicated that it does not feel that linked fate. I think you have to, as people have said, dedicate a tireless focus to reminding Michigan that Detroit and all of these other cities under municipal management matter. This is a time for an unprecedented get out the vote campaign. It is a time for street level organizing to remind Michigan politically that there are a lot of people in this state who who care. And I'm wrapping up right now. Detroit's fate matters not only for borrowing rates for other Michigan cities, which is an argument that the governor may well understand. It matters not only for public safety issues, but of course for humanitarian reasons. And it's very difficult to work across extreme class lines. It is not just racial lines that are dividing you from the state capital, it is class lines. And finding a way to work across those divides is so important. And I think the motto of this work has to be something like, Detroit needs Lansing, and Lansing needs Detroit. So how do you get to that point? So I admire the people of this city. I admire your determination, your resistance, your resilience and survival. I admire that your culture seems to prize art and music over shopping. And your middle-class heritage, our country, my home in San Francisco, needs your leadership. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Since I have 10 minutes, I'd like to use roughly around about 1 minute saying one thing. I think it is with John and the team who put together this conference. Would you please stand? Well, it seems like I didn't have to say anything. Okay. But I'd like to say this much to you. I really would like to compliment John and his team, because this is what we are going to have to do to pull ourselves out of this. We're going to have to sit at the table and have a constructive and positive dialogue and talk about ways in which we can move our community forward. This is rare. For all of the pain that we've gone through, we have not had this. I'm so sorry to say it's taken us this long, but we are here, and I'd like to compliment the team for pulling this together. This is outstanding. And my prayer is that this will not stop in Detroit, that it will move to Benton Harbor, that it will move to Flint, that it will move to Saginaw, that it will move to all of these communities that are being faced with this tragedy that the governor and the Michigan legislator is imposing on us.
Exactly.
Good morning. As mentioned already, I'm Gregory Easton, the former administrator of the city of Flint. I would like to be completely transparent and say to you, I have a very serious reservation about the state's EFM law. There was no justifiable reason for the city of Flint to be put under control of the state treasurer's office. That said, I waited and remained silent for more than a year to see if anything meaningful and significant would come out of this process, and it did. The city of Flint went from an $8.5 million deficit in 2011 under elected leadership to a $19.7 million deficit in 2013 under two state-appointed EFMs. Now, 2.5 years later, with Flint under its third EFM, there still is at least a $13.5 million deficit, $5 million more than existed in 2011. So you do the math, and you tell me, how has Flint benefited from the imposition of an EFM? I'm appalled at how a significant amount of the city of Flint's major assets have been sold off and given to other individuals and institutions for virtually nothing by the EFM. The mayor and the Flint City Council have virtually no power, and the EFM has almost limited the voice of the people at city council meetings. And he has threatened to limit the voice of a certain city councilman who has chosen to speak out against many of the atrocities that are occurring in Flint under EFM law. I will give you another example of this misuse of power. Water and sewer rates have increased by over 200% in Flint households. There are numerous complaints from our senior citizen population who have decreased their consumption of water, but yet their water bills have more than doubled and tripled in some cases. Flint residents will soon be on the hook for new water pipeline from Lake Huron. A conservatively estimate of this pipeline is roughly somewhere between $250 to $300 million just to not buy water from Detroit and to give contracts to companies not representing our community or our residents. In 2011, the Flint EFM proposed a public safety millage to the public and used the fact that Flint has one of the highest crime rates per capita to promote the public safety millage. He promised that he would use the additional millage funds to hire more police officers and implement several other public safety measures. Over the next 5 years, the millage can generate as much as $20 million. And yet, less than $500,000 have been used to hire police officers. In fact, new police officers' salaries have been reduced from an average annual salary of $55,000 a year to $32,000 a year, plus limited benefits. Virtually none of the public safety dollars are being used to protect the citizens of Flint. Governor Snyder's EFM has intentionally withheld over 90% of the public safety funds to demonstrate, on paper, a balanced budget. This hoax was perpetrated on 60% of the Flint population who happen to be African American, but live in neighborhoods where 95% of the crime take place and 71% of the blight continues to exist. State EFMs are using taxation as a tool to address the financial stress of cities. This taxation is done without representation or vote of the people. What I'm trying to show you is that those who least can afford to pay are absorbing the new taxes and are being victimized by a law and a process Michigan voters said no to on a ballot referendum for Public Act 4. I ask you, where is the justice and humanity in this kind of state and local policy? Why would an EFM intentionally manipulate and mislead people who are already disadvantaged racially and economically just to do the bidding of the Michigan state legislator and the governor? It is because our state government does not care about Detroit, and it does not care about any other communities in Michigan that have similar demographics. I find it quite interesting that the majority of the cities under EFM law are majority African American. Do you honestly believe that these cities are the only communities who are facing financial challenges? Do you honestly believe that the majority of our suburban communities are fiscally healthy? Does the governor, the state legislator, and the state treasurer believe that their current practices and policies that strip communities of revenue, denigrate and disenfranchise local residents is a way to bring Michigan back? Furthermore, on almost every recent report comparing states, it shows Michigan is lagging further behind almost every other state, and Michigan's African American population, particularly children, and even more specifically, our black boys, are at the bottom of the heap on important indicators. These same communities, due to loss of businesses, jobs, economic development, community development, poor housing, flight to the suburbs, and poor quality schools, and communities are the communities with the highest rate of poverty and less able to bear the increased tax burden levied by the EFM. African Americans make up approximately 14% of Michigan's population. Of that 14%, Detroit represents almost half of the state's African American population. If you add Pontiac, Highland Park, and Flint, I would be surprised if we had 70 to 75% of the state's black population disenfranchised under the EFM. What I'm trying to show you is how this discriminatory and unfair state policies are disproportionately impacting people of color who are already struggling to barely make ends meet. There are senior citizens on fixed incomes who cannot afford to move out of the urban communities. Many of them are single mothers of color who are faced with decreased levels of public assistance over the next 2 or 3 years. I believe in being fiscally responsible, accountable, and ensuring the financial health of a community. It is the right thing to do. In fact, this could have been achieved without the imposition of a governor imposing EFM law, who I think is synonymous with a dictator.
It is.
The mayor and the Flint City Council could have achieved a balanced budget and implemented several modest changes to city services. The state could have been a helpful partner. In fact, Mayor Walling and the Flint City Council did propose a bond that would have eliminated the city's deficit and positioned the city to achieve a new balanced budget and substantial savings. However, the state treasurer, Andy Dillon, refused to work with the city's leadership. Seems like he had the same problem here in Detroit. Similar to Detroit, the city of Flint proposed a consent decree, but it was not considered. State leadership had no interest whatsoever in working with local government in urban areas to assist locally elected officials to move their communities forward. What we have is a dictatorship that continues to undermine the democratic process, subvert the vote and the will of the people, and unfairly and disproportionately tax communities who can least afford it. This environment creates a greater divide between the haves and the have-nots, while our state government has continued to be dishonest, lack transparency, and demonstrates nothing less than a feeling of apathy toward communities of color. In closing, Governor Snyder should know that he can't continue to use EFM to justify these unfair state policies that are being imposed on communities that are majority African American. It is totally unfair for Governor Snyder to allow his EFMs to paint a picture that African American elected and appointed officials are solely responsible for the financial challenges of urban communities in Michigan due to mismanagement and corruption. That is an unfair representation. We are all former manufacturing communities that have lost hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs over the last 30 years, resulting in substantial loss of tax revenues. What urban communities in Michigan need from this governor is a strategy and resources that will result in community revitalization in housing, minority business development, economic development, community development, workforce development, and state shared revenues that the governor has taken from these communities. We must work together to demand better if we want something different. Detroit, Flint is with you. We all must raise our collective voices and our collective votes for a better future for our communities and families. If we do nothing, then there is a political and economic tsunami coming to Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, and other communities which comprise a majority African Americans. If we don't speak out against this travesty, then we have no one else to blame but ourselves.
That's right.
Thank you.
My name is June Thomas. I'm a professor down the road in Ann Arbor, but don't hold it against me. First, I want to apologize for not being here last night. I was actually teaching a class. I teach urban planning students, and the class I was teaching last night, we're actually working on the Mount Elliott Industrial District, like what can be done to bring back jobs for Detroit. A lot of us in academia, we do that every day. We work with students and we try to help them figure out how to help people. But having said all that, and even though I do all of that, and other people do as well, I must admit I'm just a little bit, I'm just saddened by the situation we're facing today. And I just want to tell you, most of my work has been writing histories of Detroit and writing histories of redevelopment in Detroit. And if you had told me 20 years ago we'd be at this state, I wouldn't have believed it. I do feel obliged to remind us that there's a reason that these places that are being put into bankruptcy and emergency financial management are black. So I'm sure that this was mentioned last night, but I feel obliged to mention right now that there is a reason. And so I want to just make at least three, four if I have the time, points. One is that we have had racially selective decentralization of central cities for a long time. That's been going on for a long time. So the reason these cities are black is not accidental. It's because essentially only certain people were allowed to leave. There was a process of suburbanization that was financed by federal dollars and state dollars. So it's not by happenstance that we're looking at the demographics of these central cities. This has been a trend taking place most assuredly since the end of World War II, and it was financed by racially selective mortgages, by financing of property taxes, by highways. Don't get me started on highways. The reason the highways are crumbling right now is because we built so many and didn't have money to maintain them. And we didn't put money into public transit. So I just don't want us to forget that there is a historical reason that we see what we see in terms of demographics. I'd like to also mention, no one has mentioned this yet, maybe someone mentioned it last night, but there's a reason that we have this isolated central city and these small suburbs surrounding it. Michigan is a small box state. What that means is we make it very difficult to annex and very easy to incorporate. So when a developer decided to build some sort of subdivision, you get 2 or 3 subdivisions. Michigan law made it very easy to form those subdivisions into suburbs, and very hard for anybody to annex. So Detroit essentially had to stop annexing because of state law. It was the state legal system that set up the situation that led to 4 million people in southeast Michigan having over 300 units of government. Explain that to me. 4 million people in southeast Michigan have over 300 units of government. 4 million people in the Toronto district, Toronto metropolitan area, have something like 20 governments. We have over 300. This is a smaller box state than almost any state in the union. So when Carol was mentioning this morning that it's a small urban economy, that cities are small, they're isolated, that they are essentially captive to their revenues, the way we've done this in Michigan, you're really captive to your revenues because we've made it so hard to consolidate. This is a state legal system. It's been in place for a long time. I'll tell you how long. There was a mayor in the 40s who directed his staff to figure out how to annex what's now Redford Township. You didn't know that, did you? Redford Township was supposed to be annexed. Detroit couldn't annex it and the other suburbs because of Michigan law. So the state of Michigan has an entrenched municipal system that is making it very difficult to talk about any kind of cooperation. So, believe it or not, that was first point. That was first point. Okay, second point. City leaders, including urban planners, made efforts over the years to fight these decentralizing trends, but unfortunately they had the wrong tools and too few of them. The tools they thought could do this were urban renewal and clearance, which turned out to be the wrong way to go about it. So essentially, the idea was that if you could just bulldoze certain neighborhoods, that you could essentially bring back middle-class people, and that would take care of the problem. Well, you know what happened there. Essentially, of course, white people, first of all, weren't necessarily willing to move back into those former slums, which had been bulldozed. And at least for the first few years, the neighbors' rights were not protected. So people began to feel that the problem was urban renewal. Well, urban renewal was a problem. But the real problem was simultaneously, the federal government was spending many times more money paying people to leave. So here was the city that was trying to keep middle-class people and trying to keep white people, but at the same time financing the construction of highways, financing the mortgages, the cheap mortgages that let people leave. So it was almost as if you had this little teapot that you were trying to pour out on a city to heal its ills, and there is the ocean sweeping everything away. I just thought of that. That wasn't the best analogy, but that's okay. I'll keep moving. Okay, third point. The city has teetered on toward bankruptcy, not just because of chronic borrowing and not just because of government mismanagement, but also because of these structural issues. But we have to also talk about what happened with deindustrialization and the economic downturn in 2007. And I'm sure someone has mentioned this thus far, but I just feel obliged to mention it as well. Especially thinking of that because I'm working on this industrial project right now. I'm also in the process of interviewing people in neighborhoods who are trying to save their neighborhoods. My colleagues and I have picked 2 specific neighborhoods in Detroit, and we're going household to household, and we're talking to people. And I'm here to tell you that the burden of all of these financial problems is weighing on the shoulders of householders. It's weighing on the shoulders of householders. So I've talked to people. I wish I did have the time to tell you some of these stories. But I've talked to people who've stood on their porch and they've looked out and they've seen people trying to break into the empty house next door. And one lady opened up, I looked at this lady, she was so brave. She opened up her curtain and said, "You don't belong here." And the people said, "Well, yeah, who are you?" And she called the cops, and of course, nobody came. So she went out on her porch and chased them away. She bought 3 houses next to her to try to keep some sort of semblance of a neighborhood. I've talked to people who have shoveled more snow than I ever thought about shoveling, because they're shoveling their house and they're shoveling every empty house on their block.
Yep.
I've talked to people that are mowing grass. I never knew there was so much lawn mowing going on in Detroit. There are people mowing people's houses. So Detroiters, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that individual householders and Detroiters are bearing the brunt of everything we heard this morning, all of these statistics, all of this data, all of these charts. It's individual families and individual householders, and I just don't want us to forget that. So I think I have 30 seconds. I could take much more. There it is, 30 seconds. But I do believe that we have to look at the legal framework, the municipal framework. We have to look at the metropolitan area and all these things, all so that we can help support the quality of life of Detroiters.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Taylor. I'm a part of We the People of Detroit, and I would like for this time for Cecily McClellan, Chris Griffith, and Monica Lewis Patrick, who are co-founders, to please stand. We're a grassroots organization that was formed in 2008 and 9, fighting mayoral control. The mayor wasn't really doing a great job with the city, and they wanted to give him DPS at a time when there was no real reason for that. I don't want to go into that history. I'm an activist I've worked in foundations for about 13 or 14 years, private foundations, public foundations, and community foundations, about 30 years in nonprofit. And just recently, I came across an analysis, doing a power analysis, and recognized where I had been functioning most of my life. There's the economic power at the hierarchy of the power. There's political power. And at the bottom, there are foundations and nonprofits that basically deal with all the maladies and fallout created by those higher levels of power. And so I've been putting Band-Aids on and trying to do good in the hood my whole life. And I had a turn when I was downsized in 2008, and I started paying attention to the news in a different way, looking at it and saying, it's not what they're saying, it's what they're not saying. And I started going to council meetings and observing, and that's when I met some of these people that you just were introduced to. And it was just through a knowing that what was portrayed on the news was not what was really happening at the meeting that I had been present for hours, and yet it was flipped and turned. And so what I want to say, I had a bunch of different things, but the life of an activist is you have to shoot from the hip sometimes, so I'm shoot from the hip. You had enough academicians here to frame the statistics and all that. What I will say is that this is not the state that I was born in or grew up in. It is not. This is apartheid Michigan. This is apartheid Detroit. And we are living in a modern Jim Crow system. The framework and the narrative is around race and class, the hierarchy of power. And I have to say, thanks to Lori Villarreal, she's somewhere here, Villarosa, yes, back in my Mott days, for introducing me to undoing racism, because it gave me a working framework and definition for racism, and it is simply race prejudice plus power. And when you look at all the various systems, whether it's the political system, the banking system, the criminal justice system, the educational system, who controls those systems? And it takes me back to what Sister Angela Glover Blackwell and Dr. John Powell, who's my hero, said, who's making the decisions and who's benefiting in those systems? And what we find here in Michigan, I have personally been suffering. I worked for the Honorable Councilmember Joanne Watson for the last 3 years of her term. She was the most fierce and most articulate fighter for the people and voicing the truth, speaking truth to power, and backing it up with facts and intellect, heart, and passion, and a lot of hard work. We worked 60, 80-hour weeks for 3 years in a row. And what I can say is that most Detroiters and activists see Detroit under attack from multiple levels, in multiple silos, continuously, and it manifests itself in many different ways. What I can say, too, is from my own reflections, I recognized after the civil rights movement, and I was a teenager, young teenager, adolescent almost really, when Martin Luther King was killed, and was one of the kids that sang, blocked the stairwell in middle school and sang, "We shall overcome," and cried with the kids, and we did. You know, we were very conscious back then. But what I can say is that our strides as a people came in education, and they came in the public sector and government. And now what we find is we have a disproportionate attack on those two sectors, so we are being disproportionately impacted by the dismantling of this political agenda, which I believe the Koch brothers, who the two alone are worth about $80 billion, are a big part of this, because they have the super PAC. So what they're doing is they're funding political candidates at the local, county, state, and federal level, all the way up to Judge Scalia and the others, okay? So, okay, that's one thing, is their PAC. And then there's the Cato Institute, which most people haven't heard of, but the truth is, they crank out the repressive legislation. I just want to see a show of hands. How many people have heard of Stand Your Ground? Raise your hand, please. Okay, that's Cato Institute, thank you. How many people have heard of Right to Work? And I always say for less, because they give these names to things that if you don't do any research, you think that's good for you, right? How many people have heard of Right to Work? Okay, that's Cato Institute. What about the voter suppression laws, the gerrymandering? Okay, so that they crank big time money into that. And the Mackinac Policy Center that has the leadership, I know there may be many people in here that attend that, but that is a part of the apparatus and the structure that has dismantled our charter and opened it up under the guise of not being able to remove Kwame Kilpatrick as mayor when all of this storm of activity occurred, when the truth is they could have amended it and not revised it. But what happened? We had over 400 and some revisions that came forth, but under the guise of there was only one thing that needed to be changed. And the way it even got on the ballot is really illegal and questionable, and I don't have time to go into that. So I'm talking off the top of my head. I want to head somewhere with solutions, but I want to take the opportunity, since I have the platform for a minute, because the media is a big part of the role of why people are misinformed and disengaged, especially the corporate media. And we have to say, what, Rupert Murdoch is worth $5-point-some billion, and he controls almost 1,000 news outlets around the world. We don't control the message. And so, since I have a few moments, I am going to rattle off some facts that you may not know. The state of Michigan advised the mayor of the city of Detroit not to take a historic coalition of unions concessions of over $105 million, a savings yearly that could have avoided this bankruptcy. Was that in 2011, Cecily? Yes, 2011, which was a breach of trust. The state advised the mayor, do not take it to the council table for them to vote on. So that was another form of sabotage. I could really do a long list. There could have been a renegotiation of the health care for employees that Councilmember Joanne Watson put out there, because we could have saved, we were paying $300 million to Blue Cross Blue Shield, and we could have saved $200 million on that. There was over $300 million in CDBG funds, HUD funds, weatherization dollars, some that were sent back, some that were stockpiled, and now who's going to get that money but a non-government entity, the Blight Authority, Mr. Pote, I understand, also has a company to produce and manufacture new housing material. So we see where that's headed. Okay. Public Lighting Authority is a farce. A $154 million contract was given to DTE in the fall of 2011, if I can remember correctly, yes. And that was contracted out of our general fund. Okay. The Public Lighting Authority was really unnecessary, and it was imposed by the state. They tried to get it through once. It didn't go. They got it in. And now the city of Detroiters are going to be saddled with up to a $160 million bond, when $2 million could have put 80% of the lights back on, because most of the lights needed a light bulb and labor, and they had laid off a lot of those people and gave DTE control of the facilities. Okay, $137 million coerced consent agreement of a loan came through, and then the state held those dollars, many of the dollars, and then they contracted with the transition team and set aside $27 million for groups or consulting firms like Miller Buckfire, Miller Canfield, Jones Day, and Ernst & Young. The Hans Farm giveaway, almost 600 Detroiters came out in the code, subject to security searches, And 99% of the people begged them not to give this land away. There was no appraisal done, as should have been on the property. It was given away, pennies on the dollar, international waterfront land, not to mention the fact that it's the neighborhood, the culture, none of that is taken into account. It's going to become a forest. And then the privatization of departments. Can I just hit some solutions in? Okay, thank you. Pathways to solutions. One, we need a media strategy to get the truth out to you, because I didn't get a chance to get anything. I mean, there's so much, and the people are being misinformed, and it's very unfortunate. Two, we need to count and celebrate our wins. I have a list of them. I won't go through those. But this is what I want to present as something that we could possibly work on, is a Community Activist Institute Enterprise Fund to build capacity for self-determination, democracy, community education, and civic literacy, voter education, and protection of the efficacy of the vote. I could go on and on about that, and I won't, but just to say there are real questions about if we've even really elected our officials that we have for the last several terms, and I've worked on recounts on that. So we need to look at, because what's happening is activists that are alert are burned out. They don't have a way to rejuvenate. They don't have a way and the funds to get the messages out effectively. In Detroit, you have people that don't have access to the internet, so you got to do a flyer, you got to do a text, you got to do an email, you got to do a phone tree, you got to do Facebook. You know, I mean, it's like, because everybody's at different levels of ability. And so I have more ideas about this Community Institute Fund. We need racial healing. And I want to say a thanks to Billy Hickey, who's out there, who works diligently on that as a steering committee member for uprooting racism, planting justice in the food system, and her husband. Hi, Bill. So thank you. Would like to say more, but we didn't even file the bankruptcy. The governor did through his appointee, the emergency manager. So we need to change the narrative even about that. Even the title, as much as I do appreciate this opportunity, it's like, we didn't do that. Jones Day is not our legal department, but they represent us in the courts as they're the city of Detroit. We're under siege. Thank you so much.
Outstanding. Are you upset about anything yet? You just ought to be. Go ahead, sister. This was an outstanding panel. And to continue, let me bring up our discussant, a successful entrepreneur and leader over at the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion. Please welcome Frida Sampson.
Good morning. I know that I am standing solely between you and lunch, and I feel a little pressure. I want you to realize I feel that, but I'm going to be as expedient as possible. So I'm going to try this one more time, because Hester made mention in the very beginning of the day the significance of the call and response. And so I'm going to try good morning again, and I need to get a little love so that we can get through here, okay? So good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. It is a privilege to be with you this morning, and it's an additional privilege to be in such esteemed company. While you've already had them stand, I too want to thank Peter and Pancella and John Powell, that was weird calling him John Powell, Professor Powell, for the vision and for the planning and for their commitment, so that we can have a critical discourse about Detroit's bankruptcy and its impact on all of us. As Hester indicated, my role here is a little different. I'm not a scholar. I am an entrepreneur. I come from the rich tradition of the African American church community organizing, and my role at Michigan Roundtable is around robust discussions dealing with race and spatial injustice. And so that's the lane that I'm going to come from, and I may infuse those different areas of specialty as I move into my very brief comments around the panel. My job is to respond to what we have heard this morning, and I will do that as best I can. But let me first say that while we as a municipality are in the midst of bankruptcy, It's no longer a phenomenon as we have already heard, and certainly not unique to Detroit. Michelle has already indicated that 27 other cities are facing it in some capacity. We do have the challenge, however, by being one of the largest. And so how we respond determines not only our future, but it will inform other cities on the heels of our experience. So the all eyes watching Detroit has multiple levels of impact. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this discussion because it shows me something that I think is very important, and that this is more than just an exercise in scholarship. But this is an opportunity for community and scholars to process collectively, to come to a more holistic and inclusive space in thinking and acting toward solutions. In the work I do with Michigan Roundtable, I spend a great deal of time talking about matters of race. Race is a key conversation in where we stand today. I also spend time talking with the community in illuminating our history, how we got here, specifically how race has informed our journey that has created the segregation that so profoundly cripples us as a region. And I'm going to offer my reflections from there. We heard our panelists this morning give some brief overviews around Detroit's financial state, its historical roots, and the trajectory that has us living with the injustice of bankruptcy. The common thread that I heard from all of our speakers included the role that history plays in this process. The very important fact that we are not alone. We have Flint, who has had the most extraordinary experience, but to have you stand and say to us that, Detroit, we have your back, means a lot. So thank you. We also know the role that class brings into this process and the broad engagement that is necessary around how our assets are being affected via the EFM. So, framed it in three different categories: where we were, where we are, and where we are heading. Michelle spoke to Detroit being the birthplace of the American middle class, and I agree with her not only in that regard, but I also agree that Detroit can and will be the rebirth of the reoccurring American class. Greg spoke to going in the wrong direction as it pertains to the EFM, having one level of debt load and it being profoundly exacerbated because of the ruling and the injustice of having an EFM, and understanding that there's a pin for us to put there as Detroiters to pay attention to the numbers, to pay attention and be involved. June spoke about the structure of decentralization for cities from a long time ago. Historically, we didn't get here by coincidence. This was no accident. And it's critical for us to have some capacity to speak and articulate and understand the role of our historical journey to this point. We must have some sense of how the Federal Housing Administration had implicit impact on us being so segregated. Dr. Powell and Mr. Segru spoke to that last night. And not just FHA, but the Social Security, and not just Social Security, but the real estate agents, and not just the real estate agents. And it goes on and on. The people, the mindset, have all created these tensions that have divided us not only as a people, but also in our wealth. And so at one time we were at a 12-to-1 wealth gap. We're in a 20-to-1 wealth gap now. That's going in the wrong direction. Where we are today, with this trickle-down economy concentrating more wealth between those who have and those who do not have, as Michelle spoke to, there has been a great deal of economic power, political power, and foundational power that has created something of a construction, but we still have, as Deborah has spoken to, those who are on the foundation level, those who are on the grassroots level, and those of us who are in the trenches, we have to not only pay attention, but we have to be active. We have to be the ones that are critically engaged into making the change, that we cannot sit idly by and hope things will just get better. We are heading to a space where the media, let me rephrase that, we are in a space where the media informs how much we do or don't know. And what we have learned in that is that they're telling us far less than what we need to make the kind of informed decisions so that when we go out and vote and when we go out to make the change, that we have all the tools essential. Deborah again spoke about all of the multiple ways with which we are learning and taking in information. Well, we need to capitalize our own capacity, because if we know corporate media is not telling us stuff, then we have to find our own ways to make sure that information is being provided to our larger population. We know that the system can and so often does fail people. Decisions are made behind closed doors that are not in the best interest of the many, but of the few. We can't sit idly by and hope for the best. If we did, we will perish. We must enact a movement to assure that our voices and our rights are applied to the decisions that affect us the most. While operating under a system of oppression, I contend that it takes more than just facts and data to create a movement. We have heard some amazing presentations over the last 24 hours, riddled with important factual data that helps us have the adequate tools to do what it is we need to do. But I believe it takes more than that for a movement to occur. It also takes the personalization of that data so that people can see themselves in the fight and so that they can respond to the injustices. So where am I leading? Well, one of the things I do think we need to talk about more and do more is this. We need to enact the power of the story. Not only does it bring healing and power to the voice, but it also links our fate. A week ago, last Saturday, Michigan Roundtable, along with many partners of whom many are sitting in this room, had an Equity Action Summit on criminal justice, housing, and transit. It was a culminating event of public hearings called the Healing Stories. The public hearings provided incredible imagery and testimony and the connection of faces and stories to the very issues that we've been talking about today. It moved people in a way because it personalized the experience. It took the data off the screen and off the page, and it brought it to the house and into the school and into the community. My father was a Baptist pastor for over 50 years. Yes, sir. 30 of those years right here in Detroit. And I watched and I listened to how he brought to life complex ideas and textured King James language through analogies and stories in a way that not only inspired people and gave people hope, which is part of our job, but also gave them an understanding on how to move, because through those stories, they heard themselves. Through those stories, they could speak to their own experience, and through those stories, there was a validity of their life experience that compelled them to move forward. That is our job. And I share this because when we pull back the veil of data, of statistics, of political language, and of policy, we see the faces of individuals impacted by inequality and racism. These practices that have been inflicted upon us through the bankruptcy, through the emergency manager, through the historical inequities, through all of the things that brought us to this place. These practices have got to come to an end. They've got to come to an end, and we've got to get the people on the ground to push for something different. And so what is the challenge with that? How do we get the people on the ground to move in a way that seemingly they haven't? I mean, we've been dealing with this bankruptcy situation for a while, right? We knew it was coming and then it came, and yet it seems like there hasn't been quite as much robust energy around it as it should be. Why is that? What happened? Why aren't people on the streets just mad as hell? Well, I'm going to suggest that some of it is around oppression fatigue.
Yes.
You know, when you are simply trying to get through the day-to-day, and you live under the fatigue and under the constant presence of oppression, sometimes you can't even discern when to get more mad. And so, in telling our stories, in listening, not only do we have an opportunity to hear each other and be more connected, our fates become more linked. We become more human and more sensitive to each other. And we have the capacity to operate in numbers that provide greater opportunity for success. We do better when we work together than when we don't. And if we think that we can do this without everybody participating on some level, we're not really fully understanding the breadth of what we're dealing with.
Yes.
So I see my time is coming to an end, but I do want to leave you with this quote. And it comes from Shay Howe, who's not only in the audience, but will be presenting to you later. So Shay, I hope you're not going to use this. If you do, just say it came from me, okay? But I leave you with this. How we assess the causes of this crisis, its dimensions, its responsibilities, and its solutions depend not on only the objective of a balanced sheet, but on the values we bring to the understanding of the past. And it also depends upon the vision we have for the future of this city. Thank you.